I don't know if you've noticed, but the entertainment industry has a thing for 80s nostalgia. It started fading away as we were approaching the 2020s, but it's still here. Look, I'm not a very nostalgic guy, so I wasn't that absorbed by the whole 80s nostalgia trend. I'm not saying that just to seem superior or anything like that, let's make that clear. In fact, I enjoy watching Stranger Things and blasting Perturbator on max volume as much as anybody else. It's just that I was born in the early 90s, so if I were to be nostalgic about something, I'd be more sentimental towards early to mid 2000s media, which coincided with my formative years. So, you know, less Ghostbusters and E.T. and more Pimp My Ride in Jersey Shore. So when I discovered Crossing Souls, a game that is the very definition of 80s nostalgia, I figured it would be a great exercise in restraint. As I was downloading the game, I promised myself that I would not be seduced by its gorgeous pixelated graphics and give it a fair and objective assessment. Oh boy. Crossing Souls is an action-adventure beat-em-up style game developed by Spanish studio Fourratic. The game takes place in the small Californian town of Tujunga in the summer of 1986. The story centers around 5 kids: Chris, an adventurous jock; Matt, the smart kid; Big Joe, the strong boy with a heart of gold; Charlie, an outspoken girl with a troubled childhood; and Kevin, Chris's little brother. And that's pretty much it as far as his character goes. So after reuniting in a conveniently gamey way during a section that teaches you the basics of the gameplay... God, I wish... No, I'm not doing this again. Our group of rowdy knuckleheads obtains the so-called Dwat Stone, an ancient artifact that allows them to travel between the real world and the realm of the dead. Naturally, this attracts the attention of a shadowy paramilitary organization. Turns out, they were planning to use this device to take over the world before it was stolen by a dissenting group of scientists. So, as you can probably guess by that short introduction, Crossing Souls is par for the course as far as 80s inspired media goes. In terms of presentation, Crossing Souls got me hooked from the first second. Visually, this game is quite a treat, especially in the opening act where Tujunga checks all the boxes of a fictional American small town in the 80s. You got your picturesque suburban cul-de-sac with zany neighbors, a noisy arcade which of course the publisher used to sneakily advertise its catalog, a sleazy diner where teens gather to hang out and share gossip, and a comic book store. Since my infatuation with pixel art graphics ended sometime between The Binding of Isaac Rebirth and Enter the Gungeon, I was surprised to find myself entranced by the visuals. Chris's house, otherwise known as Yuppie Central, is a perfect example of the talent and effort that went into designing this world. Adding to that is the extreme attention to detail. These details, which can be as ubiquitous as, I don't know, movie posters and gaming consoles, or as subtle as a Joey's Pizzeria sign popping from the background, make this world feel very authentic. I also have to give the devs props for the gorgeous animated cutscenes, which give the game a Saturday morning cartoon vibe. However, like the overly romanticized period Crossing Souls pays homage to, everything that I've just mentioned so far is just an illusion. A good looking one, but an illusion nonetheless. In the prologue, Crossing Souls mimics the structure and mechanics of a semi-open world game with minimal RPG elements and a party-based combat system, when in fact it's anything but that. The first 3 hours or so consist of exploring the charming town of Tujunga, interacting with characters and objects, and a few sections meant to familiarize players with each character's unique mechanics. You're given some degree of freedom of movement in the form of a few environmental puzzles here and there, and maybe a couple of side quests. But even during those quaint first 3 hours, I felt there was something off about the design of this game. The first red flag came up right before leaving Tujunga. I found a few videotapes and game cartridges and I thought, hey, Chris has a console in his room, maybe I can check them out there. As it turns out, the only way leading to his room was blocked by his mother, who suddenly decided to mop the floor upstairs. How convenient. But hey, maybe I'm just a cynical fuck and the next hub areas will be better. But there is no next hub area. Okay, maybe the game will be carried by its combat and level design. No. How about the story writing and characters? So first, let's talk about the gameplay. As I've mentioned before, Crossing Souls is an action-adventure beat-em-up game with some puzzle solving and platforming thrown into the mix. The game puts 5 characters at your disposal, each with their own unique ability. Chris can knock projectiles with his baseball bat, climb on walls, and jump. Matt can glide over to surfaces that Chris can't reach by jumping, and has an energy weapon that can be used to solve certain puzzles. Charlie is by far the most agile of the group and sports a whip that deals higher damage than Chris's baseball bat and Matt's energy weapon put together. Big Joe is the tank. He hits like a fucking truck and is capable of moving heavy objects. And finally, Kevin. Let's just say he's vital for solving some puzzles and leave it at that. You don't control all 5 characters at the same time, rather switch between them on the fly as the situation demands it. So for example, you can select Charlie to dodge projectiles because she's objectively the best at that and switch to Big Joe to deal damage. The same thing applies to puzzle solving and platforming. So far so good, right? Well, the problem is that for most of the game's duration you'll end up using only a couple of characters. That's because they're either useless in combat, move too slow, or their so-called unique abilities are grossly underutilized. For example, Charlie's catapult mini puzzle appears only 3 times during the course of the game, and Matt's ability to energize devices is relevant during only 1 boss fight. The worst thing about this system is that the game forces you to use their unique abilities in the most annoyingly arbitrary ways possible. I can understand making Chris the only character capable of climbing on vines because he's the most physically fit kid in the group and all that, but ladders? Please tell me why Charlie or Matt or Big Joe, all part of the so-called latchkey generation of kids who did stupid shit with little to no parental supervision by the way, can't climb up ladders. Do you know how many ladders this game has? Why do I have to switch to Chris each time I want to climb one? Does Matt have an anti-ladder bias? Is this some convoluted way to suggest that Charlie went on to become an anti-ladder lobbyist as an adult? Oh shit, is Crossing Souls just propaganda material commissioned by the Elevator Industrial Complex? Okay, sorry, I'm being a bit unfair to the game. It's not that this ladder business is a huge issue in and of itself, rather that it's symptomatic of a much wider problem. I've mentioned earlier that Crossing Souls gives the impression of openness in the beginning. This illusion fades away as soon as you enter the second chapter. The open, detailed spaces of Tujanga are replaced by linear set pieces. Gone are the retro arcades, the corny depiction of suburbia, the diners. Now all you get is generic spooky cemetery number 57, enchanted forests and caves. In the game's defense, a few of the self-contained areas are pretty creative and have some neat ideas. The abandoned frontier town haunted by Wild West tropes was well executed and a welcome distraction, and I also love the design and atmosphere of Sarducci's mansion. The issue with these areas, and this extends to the rest of Crossing Souls, is that they're dragged down by the game's over-reliance on puzzles and platforming sections. I've mentioned in my Bloodlines review that I'm not a huge fan of puzzle games. I dislike puzzle platformers even more, but I'm willing to try these games out if they're executed well. Early puzzle platforming sections are admittedly fun and quite fair, but they become increasingly infuriating as the game progresses. There's something off about how the inputs and jumping animations were programmed. If you don't time your jump in a very specific way, you'll end up falling off the ledge. Moreover, the 2.5D perspective of the game makes judging distances very tricky sometimes. You'll more often than not make a jump thinking you got the timing right, only to discover that you were a few pixels off and fall to your death. Making things even more difficult is the fact that Crossing Souls uses a checkpoint system, so if you happen to die right before completing a puzzle section, you'll have to start over. I'm not going to talk about the more traditional puzzle sections because, again, I don't like puzzles, so I'm not in a position to judge the game based on this factor. But what I can do is reiterate a previous point, that Crossing Souls relies too much on them to the detriment of other elements, like the combat and the story. The combat is just okay. There are no weapon upgrades, skill trees, attachments, or any sort of progression system in place. The combat revolves around mashing the attack button until everything's dead and dodging projectiles. And that's it as far as the combat is concerned. And I could have been more indulgent towards the combat if the game didn't suffer from a severe lack of enemy variety. And I'm not saying there are like, I don't know, 10 enemy types. No. All you fight in this game are little rats, little spiders, big spiders, exploding zombies, gelatinous blobs, and these tall dudes that look like Ghost BC tour members. So the combat gets very repetitive very fast, there's no strategy to it, and I feel like it could have greatly benefited from at least a bare bones progression system or more weapons. I could have forgiven Crossing Souls' gameplay and design hiccups if the story and writing were great, but sadly, they too come with their own set of issues. The writing is hit and miss and doesn't do anything to develop the characters. Most of what they say revolves around "we have to do this together" or "we can't give up now," with the occasional amusing banter between the friends. It also doesn't help that the characters are bland and unidimensional. I know they are supposed to evoke the tropes of 80s coming of age stories, but that doesn't excuse their lack of any sort of, you know, personality. The same thing applies to the villains and secondary characters. The villains are your regular cartoon psychopaths who want to take over the world, while the supporting characters are forgettable at best. To be fair to the game, if you want to know more about the characters, you can always open up a separate menu and read their profile. But I'm sorry, that's not how you're supposed to do character development. And while we're at it, what the fuck is up with Chris's mom and her odd mention of hippie grass? Look, I'm not a huge reefer smoker or whatever you kids call it nowadays. In fact, I'm as cool as a Frank Sinatra impersonator. But you'd think a fantasy novelist would know better than to call it hippie grass like she's a 1940s newscaster. I don't fucking know, man. Now, don't you think for a second that I enjoy criticizing Crossing Souls. This game has a lot of potential, and to Fourratic's credit, they poured a lot of love and care into it. And this is their first effort, by the way. For a debut project, you can do a lot worse than Crossing Souls. And believe me, Crossing Souls has some genuinely great story and gameplay moments. The bike chase, which is a nod to E.T., the homey feeling of the treehouse meeting. Hell, all of Tajanga is just a joy to explore and experience. But that's all they are, moments, and they make the missed opportunities to explore certain themes and experiment with gameplay mechanics sting even harder. The devs could have used this opportunity to talk about parental neglect, helicopter parenting, or hell, even deconstruct the very myths that the game is inspired after. I'm not saying that every game should do this, but Crossing Souls lays the groundwork for it and just chooses not to do anything with it. The game tries to emphasize in the beginning that these are not your regular happy-go-lucky kids, that they are human beings with feelings and traumas and insecurities, but as soon as the story progresses to the second chapter, they more or less revert to the limitations of their respective tropes. As it stands, the troubled backgrounds of these children are there just to justify their character quirks, and I'm sorry, but there's nothing funny about poverty and parental neglect. Except if it's Trailer Park Boys, now that's some funny shit. But Crossing Souls' biggest defect is that it doesn't know what it wants to be. On the one hand, it wants to tell a grounded story about friendship, community and sacrifice with a supernatural twist, but the characters are not developed enough to make you care. On the other, it wants to be a puzzle platformer with Egyptian mythology and sci-fi elements, and these two things just don't work together as well as they should. So, do I recommend this game? Not at full price. Despite starting strong, the rest of the game doesn't live up to the quality and polish of the opening act. But as a freshman effort, Crossing Souls is decent and Fourratic should be proud of what they've achieved. I'm sure Fourratic will learn from their mistakes and the next game will be a huge step up because man, they've shown a lot of talent and love for the craft of video game development. Well, that's gonna be it for this review. If you enjoyed my video, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing for more content. See you next time.